Um, oh, hang on. I've got to share the right bit. There we go. Right. All being well, you should be able to see a nice picture of the seaside and you should be able to hear me. So
am I on mute?
Somebody's not on mute. Is somebody?
I'm not on mute.
Who's that?
Sue Short.
Sue, you should be able to find the mute
on mine. Okay, I'll find
bottom
it.
left-hand corner. Otherwise, just keep quiet and make sure the phone doesn't ring.
Okay, fine. I'll try very hard. Can't hear Damien.
Damien, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, good. Right, so thank you all for joining us. This week we are in Calabria for another talk. Thank you for joining us. So Calabria, along with perhaps Basilicata, is one of the least known and least explored of all Italy's regions. One reason for that is that it's always been very difficult to get to, especially from abroad. And the other reason is perhaps the feeling that there was not very much there to see. Both these assumptions turn out to be untrue. Nowadays, there are direct flights to Calabria, at least from England to Lamezia Terme, and there are good rail connections between Rome, Naples, and the south. And it turns out there are some fantastic things to see, and I hope I'm going to be able to show you at least some of those during the course of my talk. Calabria is a large region. The distance from the top to the bottom is approximately 250 kilometers. That's about 156 miles. That's about the same distance as the crow flies as the distance from London to Exeter. But whereas somebody journeying from London to Exeter would be crossing gently rolling downs, the traveller crossing Calabria would have to traverse 3 mountain ranges, the Pollino, the Serra, and the Aspromonte. Also, Calabria has almost 500 miles of very beautiful coastline with some spectacular beaches. So it's a paradise for bathers. I mentioned the mountain ranges. Well, they are the 3 national parks in Calabria. So the first one, Pollino, is actually shared between Calabria and Basilicata. It is the largest national park in the whole of Italy. And the highest point of it is Monte Pollino itself, with a height of 2,248 meters, which is well over 6,000 feet. The Serra isn't quite as high, reaching to heights of only 1,200 meters, but it is still possible to go skiing in the Serra in the winter time. The other national park is the Aspromonte. This reaches to heights of almost 2,000 meters and is a very, very wild part of Calabria, and I'll talk quite a lot about it later. In addition to these 3 national parks, there is also a regional park around Serra San Bruno, which is very pretty, and we'll go and talk about that as well. The regional capital is Catanzaro, this town in the middle here. So I'm going to organize my talk very, very loosely, chronologically, at least the first part of the talk. So let's start off talking about ancient Calabria. And first of all, let's investigate the etymology or the name Calabria. Well, most interestingly, the name in ancient times, in Roman times, Greek times, the name Calabria actually referred to the heel of Italy, what is modern day Puglia, not the toe of Italy at all. Calabria, this modern day, what we call Calabria, the toe of Italy, was referred to as Bruttium after the Bruttians, who were an ancient Lucanian tribe. The Lucanians were peoples that lived between Basilicata and Calabria. Furthermore, Calabria and Puglia, along with Basilicata, were all collectively known as the Magna Graecia, which loosely translates as the Greater Greece, but that was a Roman term, not a Greek term. So it's all somewhat confusing, I appreciate. But most fascinatingly, the name of the country, Italy, which of course derives from Italia, the Italian name for their country, was actually a tribe of people who inhabited this region here. And it was only after the Roman conquest that Italia began to refer to the whole of the Italic peninsula. It wasn't until Byzantine times that this area was actually referred to as Calabria. So after that sort of etymological crossword puzzle, if you like, let's move on to the Greeks. The Greeks began to colonize this part of Italy from the 8th century BC onwards. Previous to this, they had already begun to colonize the area to the north of this, towards Naples, Sorrento Peninsula, and so forth. There were around a dozen Greek colonies around the peninsula. I haven't got time to mention all of them, but we are able to talk about the four primary or four most important of those colonies, of which are Sybaris, Croton, Epizephyri Locri, and Rhegion. Unfortunately, most of these sites are, if not in ruin, they are not in the state, for example, condition of the beautiful temples at Paestum or in Agrigento, or the beautiful theatre in Syracuse. But nevertheless, historically, they are important. Sibari, of course, is famous because it gives us our English word Sybaritic, which, if I'm not wrong, doesn't actually exist in Italian, or at least as far as I know, the Italian doesn't exist. Of course, in English, it means a lover of excess. And the people of Sibari famously had vinoducts as opposed to aqueducts running through their city. But unfortunately for us, the town of Sibari was built on very low-lying land, close to the sea. The water table has since risen, and much of it is underwater, and the water has damaged what was there of ancient Sibari. So there's not very much to see. Epizephyri Locri was an important town in Greek times. Epizephyri meaning of the western wind. So in other words, this was Locri of the western wind to distinguish it from Locri in mainland Greece, if you like. Unfortunately, it's difficult to find a lot to say about it to distinguish it from many of the other sites, except that it was a very fine example of Western Greek urban planning. And you can still see that on the ground as you walk through the old town of Locri. And there was also a fine temple there, and a very fine theatre. I think the most important thing about Locri these days are the beautiful pinakes, these are called, which is simply the Greek word for picture. These are terracotta tablets, baked terracotta tablets, which were produced in Locri, hundreds and thousands of them, and many of these are now preserved in the fabulous museum at Reggio Calabria. This is a domestic scene from ancient Greece, but rather lovely. I mean, it's so beautiful. You can distinguish the hairstyles, for example. You know, that you can see even the style of the dresses that they were wearing, and so forth. So really very, very beautiful and beautifully crafted, these pinakes. The other site we have to mention, of course, is Region, which incidentally nowadays, of course, is known as Reggio Calabria. Reggio, of course, is a Latin word, and it's not at all connected with the Greek word region. Region, etymologists believe, referred to the break, as if there was some sort of mythical break, I mean, between Sicily and mainland Italy. Of course, we know that the two were always disconnected, but of course the Greeks were not to know that. So nowadays there's nothing to see of ancient Region in Reggio Calabria, but there is a fabulous museum, really one of the finest, I think, in the whole of southern Italy. And by far the finest exhibit of that museum are these two superb bronzes. These were found not in Reggio Calabria, but off the coast of a town on the Ionian coast, town by the name of Riace. They are two warriors, and they date from the mid-5th century BC. They were found under the sea in 1972. They were actually found by a young boy who just happened to be diving off the coast. They belong to the transitional period between archaic Greek sculpture and the early classical style. And they're a fine example of what we call contrapposto. Now, just to remind us what contrapposto means, is essentially an artistic term, but it means that the subject has his or her weight on their back foot, and they are slightly turning their body. And in doing so, it enhances their musculature that you can see in these statues. Notice also that the subjects are slightly turning their heads. This confers the idea of movement and life. They would have had shields in their right hands, shields in their left hand, and a spear in their right hand. These have been completely lost. We don't know the sculptor. Indeed, many authorities believe that this one is perhaps 30 years older than this one. Possibly they were created by two different sculptors. And we don't really know how they got to where they were found. It's assumed it was a shipwreck, but there was no wreckage of the ship ever identified. Possibly they were jettisoned from a ship in a storm or something like that. Nowadays, sort of underwater robots have scoured the sea for other statues, and nothing has been found. So it's a little bit of a mystery. But nevertheless, we are very lucky to have these superb statues. The other place that we really need to mention is, hang on, wrong slide. Here we are, is the city of Croton, or to give it the modern Italian name, the city of Crotone. Rather tantalizingly, unfortunately, there is very little left at Croton. In fact, all there is this single column of what used to be the temple of Juno. But nevertheless, Croton was the place where Pythagoras founded his school in 530 BC. Pythagoras, of course, didn't come from Calabria. He came from the island of Samos. And there's evidence that he actually traveled widely around the world, probably going to Egypt as well, places like that, before arriving in Calabria. Of course, he's remembered for the Pythagorean theorem, you know, the 3, 4, 5 triangle. But he's also credited with all his work on the musical scale. And for the musicians amongst you, this is quite extraordinary. The Greek scale had 7 steps, and this was also to do with the 7 planets and the 7 days of the week. And Pythagoras was the one who, first of all, was able to identify what an octave was. If you're not quite sure what an octave was, or is rather, for example, if you play the note A on a piano, the next A is exactly 1 octave above it, and if you measure the vibrations per second of the string that makes the note, you'll find that the upper octave has exactly double the number of vibrations a second to the lower octave. Pythagoras worked all of this out. He observed it, it's said, by, first of all, watching a blacksmith hammering on his anvil, and then another blacksmith hammering on a smaller anvil, and noting that the sound coming from the anvils was different. With his works on the strings, he also identified what a musical fifth was, and thereon he created a very complex treatise on musical tuning. If you're interested in it, it's fascinating, but it's a little bit beyond our scope this evening. He also had a theory of the music of the spheres. As I said, the 7 notes corresponded to the 7 planets. The planets moved around the universe in harmony, and so on and so forth. Fascinating life, but not much of it to see these days, unfortunately, in Croton. So, moving on from the Greeks, the history of Calabria in many ways mirrors that of Sicily and Malta. The usual succession of Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Saracens, Normans, Aragonese, Spanish, and so on. But in the case of Calabria, the proportion of their influence was different. So after the Greeks, just as at Paestum, in Basilicata, for example, the Greeks came under pressure from local tribes known as Lucanians, and they lived up in this area here. These were indigenous tribes, and in particular, I think I mentioned it was one of these tribes, the Brutti, that gave Calabria its name Bruttium, which is what it was known as in Roman times. Then, with the sacking of Rome in 410 AD, the king of the Visigoths, Alaric, journeyed south through the Italian peninsula, and it's thought that he contracted malaria and he died somewhere down here in Cosenza. And it's said that he is buried under the riverbed of the river Busento around Cosenza. That's an obscure fact, I grant, but it's interesting because we had it in the lecture today. Somebody knew about this. Anybody who knows anything about Germany apparently knows about King Alaric because there was a famous German poem about him that recounts this, and apparently all the kids in Germany at school learned this poem off by heart. Anyway, that was King Alaric. After that, so Calabria in Roman times was mainly under the control of the Lucanians. But having said that, there were a few Roman sites, notably this town, Scolacum, here, which is not actually on my map, but is just south of Catanzaro. And there is today a fabulous Roman amphitheatre. I mean, not quite as big as the Colosseum and not as in quite as good condition, but nevertheless, surprising to find it this far south in the Italian peninsula. Now, the important person to note from Scolacum was a gentleman by the name of Cassiodorus. Cassiodorus lived in the 6th century AD. He was a famous administrator, and he founded this basilica, a monastery here, which still exists today. It's a fabulous building. But the importance of Cassiodorus is that he was the first person to collate the various books of the Bible, and therefore to produce the first Latin Bible in a single volume. So your Bible, your single volume Bible, owes its existence to this place here, Scolacum, in Calabria, in Italy. Thereafter, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian seized Calabria from the Ostrogoths, and Calabria was to remain Byzantine for the next 500 years. In other words, they spoke Greek. And this was despite Charlemagne making Latin the official language of Italy in the 8th century. Still, Greek thrived down here. It was further fortified by arrivals from the Greek peninsula as people came under threat in Greece. So the Byzantine religion flourished, and also the Greek language. So much so that in towns like Bova, today, they still speak this Greek dialect. Unfortunately, I haven't got any examples of it. I mean, you can go and look on YouTube. If you look up Bova on YouTube, you'll hear people speaking the Greek dialect here in southern Italy. But nevertheless, in the town of Bova, the street names are written in 3 languages. Italian, this is the Greek dialect spoken by the people of Bova, and the first one is this is the modern Greek equivalent. I'm not certain about this because I don't know the Greek dialect. I don't know what this means. I have a feeling that these 3 words are not actually translations of each other. I would need to do a little bit more research on that. So, as I said, the Greek Orthodox religion flourished down here in Calabria, and as a result, many important monasteries were founded down here, and it was also the destination of hermits and Basilian monks. When we talk about Basilian monks, we really just mean Greek Orthodox monks. And here in the town of Stilo itself is a Greek word, we have this beautiful church known as La Cattolica. La Cattolica was built in the 9th century. It's the most important example of Byzantine architecture in Calabria, and it is built entirely of brick on a plan of a Greek cross, but in which the corners are filled in, and then it has these rather lovely domes on the top of the corners, which I always think look rather like the hat of a Greek Orthodox priest. There we go. And of course, when it was originally constructed, the interior would have been completely bedecked with these beautiful frescoes. Now, unfortunately, we've lost some of them, but there are still a few of them. We can still identify the figures in them. And what we can also identify is that there are actually at least 3 different layers of these frescoes. So at some time in the course of its history, the frescoes were actually painted over and the church was redecorated. So, for example, this rather beautiful one, this is the death of the Virgin Mary. And notice underneath her, we have the unbeliever who's holding her up. And this is the Archangel Michael, who is cutting off the heretics or the unbelievers' hands. Typical Byzantine almond lozenge shape up at the top here, Christ in the lozenge, and the archangels around the outside. And you can see vestiges of older mosaic frescoes here on the outside. This is a rather lovely one, and embarrassingly, I've realized I can no longer remember who this depicts. It might actually be that we don't know it, or alternatively, it could be Saint Basil himself. He is a saint. You can tell that by his halo behind his head, clutching the Bible and giving the blessing to his people. So very, very beautiful church here at Stilo. Nearby to Stilo, just less than 10 miles away, is this rather fascinating place by the name of San Giovanni Teristis. It is another, this time a Norman monastery, dedicated to a local saint by the name of San Giovanni Teristis, who you would be forgiven if you have not heard of. He is local to Calabria. The legend states that he lived in the 9th century. His mother was a local woman who, while she was pregnant with him, she was married to a local farmer, and one night the Saracens attacked. They killed her husband, Giovanni's father, and they carried her off to Palermo. And Giovanni was born in Palermo, but as a teenager, he persuaded his mother to escape, and they returned to Calabria, where Giovanni lived his days as a hermit. It then became an important site of pilgrimages, and in the 11th century, this rather beautiful Norman monastery was constructed. It continued to be a monastery throughout the Middle Ages until in the 15th and 16th century, it suffered a lot of attacks by brigands and so forth from around the local area. And the monks apparently had to relocate to Stilo for their own safety. But there's a lovely end to this story, because in 2008, it was restored and it was given on a 99-year lease to the Roman Orthodox Church. They now inhabit it. There's a community of monks there. You can visit it. You can't take photographs inside, but it's very beautifully restored inside. And it's quite a moving visit, actually. This next photograph is a view over, so the monastery is somewhere down here. This is Stilo is on the hillside here, but just to give you some idea of the location in which this monastery is to be found. So we briefly mentioned the Saracens. The Saracens attacked Calabria in the 9th century, but they never made very much of an impact here. So despite that, throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, it was mainly still the Greeks who were inhabiting here. And in the 9th and 10th centuries, Calabria became an important center for the cultivation of mulberries and the production of silk. So much so that by the 10th century, half of the silk sold in Europe was apparently produced here in Calabria. I'm going to take you on a little tour now of some other nice places to visit around Calabria. But we're going to start off with going to visit Serra San Bruno. And we can continue our chronological theme because Serra San Bruno brings us to the Norman occupation of Calabria. And the Norman phase of Calabria, so in other words, we're talking about the 11th and 12th centuries now, is a particularly important one. Just before we visit Serra San Bruno, let me remind you of some of the Norman history that we learnt when we studied about Sicily, the Norman kings. There was Count Roger, sometimes known as Roger I, and his son, Roger II. Well, before they arrived in Sicily, they had already conquered much of Calabria. Count Roger, so we're talking about the middle of the 11th century here, he started out as pretty much a brigand in a town here, a town by the name of Castella. But by the sort of later part of the 11th century, 1060 and so forth, he had actually ensconced himself in a place called Mileto here in Calabria, so not far away from Serra San Bruno. And in fact, Count Roger was to die in Calabria in 1101. And the other important connection is that his son, Roger II, was born here in Calabria, in Mileto. So very, very important connections between the Sicilian Norman kings and Calabria. And, as I'm just about to tell you, the nearby town of Serra San Bruno. Serra San Bruno is a pretty remote place. It's just a very thick forest, but in the middle of this forest there's this fabulous Carthusian monastery. You can't go into it because it's a closed order, and I took this photograph by climbing on the top of the wall and then sort of holding my camera above my head. But nevertheless, the story of this order is fascinating. Saint Bruno, founder of the Carthusian order, was born in Cologne in 1030, a year before Count Roger was born in Normandy. Both of them were to die in 1101 in Calabria. So apart from being contemporaries, there's another connection as well. So Bruno was the head of an episcopal school in Reims in France, and among his pupils was the future Pope Urban II. Bruno then went on to found a brotherhood of monks at Chartreuse in France. Urban went on to become the Pope in Rome and was then involved in a struggle with the anti-Pope Clement. He called on Bruno to help him, and the two of them were eventually obliged to evacuate Rome, and they headed south. To start off with, Bruno holed out in a hermitage near to Scolacum, place that I told you about a few moments ago, until Count Roger of Mileto gave him this land here in what was to become Serra San Bruno in order to found his monastery. And the two men became friends. So Roger gave Bruno the land for the monastery, and Bruno became the confessor to Count Roger. there is also evidence that he christened or baptized the young Roger II, the great King Roger of Sicily. And it is via San Bruno we think that Roger had connections, therefore, to Pope Urban, and therefore certainly this enabled him to or helped his way to become king of Sicily. Remember that prior to this, Sicily was not a kingdom, it was just an island. So an important place to visit, actually, Serra San Bruno, even if actually you can't go into the monastery. This here is the little chapel built on the site where Bruno was supposed to have lived as a hermit. So an interesting place, nonetheless, Serra San Bruno. So moving on from that, we are going to go and where are we going to go and visit now? Yes, so if I may, I'm just going to take you on a sort of a loose visit around some nice places to see in no particular order. And the first place I want to show you is La Castella here on the coast. And as its name tells us, predictably enough, it is a castle, rather fabulous castle built by the Angevins. So this was the latter part of the 13th century. King Charles of Anjou, of course, in France. These were the French, not at all popular, their reign here in southern Italy. But they did, especially in Calabria, leave us with some rather wonderful fortresses and castles. The other curious thing about La Castella, which I'm going to mention just in passing, since last week we were talking about Malta and the great siege of Malta in 1565, is this chap here. He was born in La Castella and he was known as Giovanni Occhiali. Now, Giovanni Occhiali went off and put himself in service of the Sultan in Constantinople, Sultan Suleiman. He's Turkified his name, if you like, and he became known as Kılıç, which means sword in Turkish, conveniently, Kılıç Ali. So Occhiali became Kılıç Ali, and he was one of the admirals that blockaded Malta in 1565. Quite an extraordinary story, I always think. Another place I want to take you to visit is the town of Gerace here. Gerace, I think, is without doubt my favorite place in the whole of Calabria. A very, very pretty place indeed. It takes its name apparently from a falcon by the name of Hyrax in Greek. We can't identify what kind of falcon it is. It's a generic name for a falcon. Apparently the legend says that it was the people of Locri, when they were being troubled by the Saracens, they wanted to build a new city somewhere else. They released a falcon, a Hyrax, and wherever this falcon landed, that would be where they built their new city. And it landed here on the modern day city of Gerace. It's a very, very pretty place. It has a fabulous Norman cathedral, beautiful castle. You can't visit the castle, it's ruined, but nevertheless a beautiful sight. And it's wonderful just to wander around the streets of Gerace. This is us having lunch here one lunchtime. This was a wedding that I stumbled across. Calabrian weddings are even more elaborate than Sicilian weddings. But the other thing of interest, I think, about Gerace is that in 1847, the English painter and writer Edward Lear stayed here. Now, Edward Lear, of course, is known to us mostly for his nonsense poetry, the owl and the pussycat in particular. But he was a fantastic painter. He had some beautiful pictures, paintings of birds, and some beautiful etchings, in particular of his travels down here in Gerace, or in southern Italy, in Calabria in general, actually, I should say. But in Gerace, there is an exhibition of his etchings. He had rather a sad life, actually. He never married. He lived, to all intents and purposes, I think, if I'm not wrong, in Rimini. He was very good pianist as well, very good musician. I think he even composed music, but nevertheless, he had a rather lonely life. But one of the other places that he traveled to was this godforsaken place called Pentedattilo, right down here on the very southern tip of the peninsula. Now, Pentedattilo nowadays is almost entirely abandoned. As its name suggests, its name is Greek. The origins of the village were Greek, and its name describes the 5 fingers of rock pointing up here. And Edward Lear came here in 1847 and did this rather beautiful etching of this extremely remote place. I mean, he must have come here on a donkey or a horse or something like that. This is my photograph of the same town. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the same perspective as Edward Lear because I was on the wrong side of the valley, but nevertheless. Another place I'd like to take you to is Tropea. Tropea is, to all intents and purposes, a resort town, very pretty resort town, but you'll understand why when you see the color of the water. Now, could there be a more perfect turquoise color to the sea? And I promise you there are no filters in this photograph. This is just me standing on the rock, looking down and taking a photograph of it. Absolutely beautiful color of the water. And this photograph was taken in the middle of August, so not even by Italian standards, at least, a very crowded beach. Let me also take you to Morano Calabro. This is right up in the north part of Calabria. Very pretty town, and nowadays they've made it into a kind of living museum. You wander around the streets. A lot of the houses have these peppers drying in the sunshine. Now, this is a typical food of Calabria. These particular ones are not the spicy peppers. They do have the spicy peppers in Calabria, but these are slightly larger peppers, probably about 8 inches in length, and they dry them in the sun, and then they cook them in an extraordinary way. They drop them into boiling oil for just 3 or 4 seconds, and they turn solid, and then they chop them up, break them up, and they taste absolutely like potato crisps. Astonishing, but they're quite delicious and extremely Moorish, and a real treat as we travel around Calabria. If any of you have been making your own bread during the lockdown, you'll no doubt have wanted your own oven. Well, in one of the villages we visit in Antonimina, sure enough, one of the houses has its own bread oven. Here it is, tacked on the back. The door to the oven, of course, is inside the house, and it's just sort of held up in midair by this this tree trunk here. Some lovely castles as we go around. This one is Oriolo. Another one here at Santa Severina. Other beautiful Norman churches here in San Giovanni in Fiore, and the interior of it here. And talking of food, I haven't mentioned the bergamot, for which Calabria is famous. Now, Calabria produces about a quarter of all Italy's citrus fruit. It produces all of the bergamot produced anywhere in the world. Bergamot is an orange, albeit with a green or yellow colored skin and a green colored interior. Now, bergamot, as you'll be familiar, it's used as an essence, particularly for flavoring things like Earl Grey tea, Lady Grey tea, but also for it's used in confectionery, and it's also used in perfume. And also, as I learned recently, if you put the oil of bergamot on your skin, so it used to be used as a sort of, what are those things called, a sort of tanning, to help you tan, but it's actually carcinogenic if you do so. So it's no longer used to help people tan. So that is the bergamot. Recently, there has been some attempt to produce bergamot juice and market it rather like orange juice or lemon juice, but it's extremely bitter and not particularly flavoursome. So just sort of rounding off the history of Calabria, at the end of the 18th century, the French took control and Napoleon gave the Kingdom of Naples to his brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, who actually was put to death by firing squad in Pizzo. And then in the unification of Italy, Calabria, or after the unification of Italy, I should say, Calabria suffered greatly, with a feeling in Rome that the Mezzogiorno, so-called southern Italy, was so helplessly poor that it was beyond redemption. The Italian state seemed unable to fund schools or teachers, and by the end of the 19th century, about 70% of the population was illiterate. There was mass immigration from Calabria to particularly the United States, also South America and Australia, and many of the towns of Calabria fell very much into ruin. This one here is the town centre of Cosenza. And this allowed the mafia to thrive, unfortunately. The mafia in Calabria has its own name. The name is 'Ndrangheta, so it's a sort of parallel organization to the mafia in Sicily, the Camorra in Campania. And over recent years, they have become increasingly powerful, ironically, on account of the new container port that has been built down in Gioia Tauro, supposedly to boost the economy of the region. But what it has also done, it's opened the doors to the shipments of drugs into Europe from South America and so forth. So talking of brigands and bandits and so on, the Aspromonte. So just to remind us where we are on the map, that is the very, very southern tip of Calabria down here. The Aspromonte has long been the hideout of brigands. In fact, some of you will remember the kidnapping of Paul Getty's, was it his nephew, in the 1970s. And he was hidden here in the Aspromonte because there's absolutely no way that the security forces can find people here. So it's long been the hideout of brigands, but recently, I'm happy to report that they've created this beautiful footpath through the Aspromonte. And in September, I was lucky enough to go try it out for a few days, try out some of the walks, and it is utterly beautiful. I'm happy to report I didn't come across any brigands at all, but these are just some of the shots from my walk. So I came across, just horses, wild horses grazing in the forest. It's all under forest, beautiful beech trees. So even though it was September, it's still very hot in the sunshine, beautiful, cool here in the forest. Waterfalls and so forth, olive glades, and views out over to the coast. And in wandering around here, I came across this extraordinary monument, which I put in the photographs because I know that we have some people from Canada joining us this evening. And this monument commemorates a battle that took place on the 8th of September between the Canadian forces, 8th of September 1943, I should say, between the Canadian forces and the Italian forces. What happened was that the Canadian forces had arrived in the Aspromonte, and the Italians parachuted in. It was a battalion of paratroopers with the idea that they were going to attack the Canadians. As it turned out, they found themselves to be vastly outnumbered by the Canadians, and to all intents and purposes, they just fled. But the extraordinary thing about this battle is that it took place after the surrender of the Italian forces to the Allies. To all intents and purposes, the Italians involved in this attack had never known that, in fact, their country had actually already surrendered. So it was a little bit of a tragedy, and many Italians were actually killed in the battle, and that's what this monument commemorates. The other thing up in the mountains here is the Monastery of Polsi, where they have fabulous pilgrimages and festivals at the beginning of September. This is not actually my photograph, and it's not taken this year. I to be honest, I didn't visit Polsi, obviously because of COVID and so forth this year. But it's incredible to note that until a few years ago, the only way to reach Polsi was on foot. Nowadays, it is possible to get there by lorry. The Calabrians go by lorry. And you can see that they are there's some sort of dancing going on here in the middle. They're all hanging out around here. But if you look carefully, look, policemen, carabinieri, and so forth. Because as much as this was a religious festival, at the same time, it was also the time when the 'Ndrangheta used to hold their summits. So, but nowadays, so quite famously, actually, the Pope last year spoke out against the 'Ndrangheta and the Monastery of Polsi. And nowadays, it is closely controlled. So, just to finish off with, I thought what I'd like to do is play you a little bit of Calabrian music, the kind of music that they were dancing to. And if I've got this set up right, you will be able to hear what we're playing. So the instrument here is the zampogna. Zampogna, interestingly enough, is not connected to the Italian word zampe, which means foot or hoof of an animal. It actually refers to a Greek word, symphonia, meaning accord or agreement, or symphony, to sound together. In this case, of course, the multiple drones and pipes of the bagpipe sounding together. So hopefully you can hear this just to round off my talk. If you can't hear, wave your arms and I'll know that something's gone wrong and I'll try and do something about it. So here we go. we go. Well, I can guarantee after about 10 minutes of listening to that music, you start to put yourself into a sort of Calabrian swirling dance. So that's the end of my talk. I'll stop the share now. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to ask questions. Just shout out, wave your arm, put your hand up or whatever, and I'll do my best to answer. Or if you just want to make a comment, feel free to chime in. Yeah.
I think,
Oh,
David,
yes.
you've done the tarantella to that.
Absolutely. Well, of course, it is connected. That they're
Yeah,
all
yeah.
connected. These, yes, absolutely. Yeah, you're quite right. Yeah.
I think I'll stick with the Scottish bagpipes.
You're welcome to, Kate.
Damien, can I ask a question?
Sure. Yes.
I had never heard of the Roman Orthodox Church. Is it connected? I mean, obviously it's connected to the Greek Orthodox Church. Do they have a different leader?
Yes. Yes. Romanian Orthodox Church.
Oh, Romanian, not Roman.
Yes. I'm not absolutely sure about this, Kate. I have a feeling it's like one of these Albanian churches in the sense that they're independent, but they look, I'm guessing here, I'm absolutely guessing that they probably look to the Pope as their leader, i.e. the Pope in Rome as their leader.
Well, I was just Googling and it says they don't.
Oh, they don't? Right.
The Pope doesn't oh, well, I forget now. Yeah, they reject the infallibility of the Pope and consider their own patriarchs. So I just that's what it says. That's what Google says.
Well,
but I don't
must
know.
be right. Google is always right.
You shouldn't believe everything you read on Google.
Damien knew.
No, I mean,
obviously I need to do a bit more homework on that, Kate. So
no, yeah, I thought if they weren't connected to that, perhaps they sort of lent obviously to the Greek. I don't know. Anyway,
they're one of these sort of independent Orthodox churches. But anyway, thank you for flagging that up. I obviously need to go and do a bit of homework and find out who they are.
So are they Roman or Roman? What did you call the
Romanian?
Oh, I heard you say Roman.
No,
Here,
Romanian.
this is what I was seeing here is the Eastern Orthodox Church. So that I might be wrong about that as well. So anyway, yeah. Oh, well. I'm sure you don't. You can't know everything, Damien. I'm sure you know a lot.
I certainly don't know everything.
Damien.
Anybody else? Yes. Oh, hello, Jenny. Yes, nice.
Hi, Damien.
Yeah.
How do you spell the word? I couldn't even hear you say it. Stranduccia, or the word for mafia in the.
Yes.
Yeah. Is it the one that begins S something or other?
No, Ndrangheta. So it's spelled.
Can you spell it?
Apostrophe.
Yes.
N.
Yeah.
D.
Yeah.
R. A. N. G. H.
Yeah.
E. T. A.
I hope somebody's writing that down because
Ndrangheta. Yeah, and it is. I used to know what it meant. It's again, it's a Greek word, and it comes from. I don't know. It's just escaped my mind, but that's where it comes from. Yeah.
Is there another name for the mafia somewhere that begins SD something or other, apostrophe? Or am I imagining that? Because I've never known how to pronounce it. And I was interested to hear you pronouncing that word.
I can't think of the ones in
I might be imagining it. Okay, thanks very much, Damien.
Camorra, but that's the ones in Calabria.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Yeah, there is Sacra Corona Unita.
Ah, yes, that's the ones in Puglia. Yeah.
Sacra Corona Unita. That's the name of the mafia in Puglia.
Puglia, yeah. Maybe that's the one you were thinking of, Jenny. Maybe. Thank you, Lara.
I sent you a message with the Ndrangheta, how it's spelled.
Ah, well done. Yeah, so you should have it there in chat, the spelling of it. Yeah. Good. Any more questions?
Yes, me as usual.
Who's that? Sorry, I can't see you.
Sue.
Oh, Sue. Yes, yes.
Sue, but I'm called Sue. I'm a nerd. I know. I jot things down. I've got about 4 questions, but they're all very short.
Go ahead. Yes.
You mentioned Cassiodorus. He was the first person to collate the first books of the Bible.
Yes.
Is there a copy of it anywhere?
There is.
Or is he
there
just
is.
credited with
There
it?
is, and there is a very interesting story about that copy, which I have completely forgotten. But go and look it up.
Right, I'll go on to my next question then. You said about in Bora, they still have this Greek dialect, Greek
Yes.
Italian dialect. If you go there, are they actually speaking it? Is it like, you know, the difference
Yes.
between going
Yes,
to
there are.
the End
Yeah.
and New?
Yes,
So
they
you
are.
s-
You
that.
hear it spoken on the streets, and also in Bova, there is a museum of the Greek Calabrian dialect, which is very interesting, and there's all sorts of videos and so on there of them speaking it and so on, and they've done a lot of research into it. It's actually quite well documented, and so forth. They do speak it, absolutely,
And
and there are
then,
a couple of other villages around there as well where they speak it. Yep.
and then at Croton or Crotone, where
Yes.
Pythagoras was, is there a Pythagoras museum there?
I'm afraid not. No,
No.
there
They-
should be, but there isn't. No.
And my final question, World War II, obviously with Malta nearby, was that toe of Italy a strategic point in World War II, or did it escape?
Not at all. No, the only involvement was, as I said, the Canadians, because what happened is that Sicily was where most of the action took place, and after, as I said, on the 8th of September, the Italians surrendered, and the German forces withdrew to the area around Salerno. So that was where, so most of the whole of Calabria was effectively, it was cut out of the war. The only thing that did happen was that the Canadian forces, they moved up over the land, sort of clearing up bridges and so forth that had been blown up. But that was all. Otherwise, there's very little evidence of it in Calabria. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank
Hope I
you.
stopped
Thank you,
anybody
thank you.
asking questions.
Anyone else?
No, Damien, I'd just like to say that I must have obviously went down by train. When I went down by train from Milan to Messina, I went
You
through
did.
Calabria, and
You
it
did.
was a fabulous train journey, absolutely fabulous. And a number of excuse me, the number of volcanoes you could see on that journey, starting off with Vesuvius and then going all the way. I think there were 5 volcanoes in one day. I mean, it was amazing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for saying that, Kate, because I agree with you. I think it is one of the great journeys, especially in train, because you can sit and just look out of the window, but also driving down. I mean, the motorway more or less follows the same route, and it is utterly stunning and beautiful. So as you say, you start off, you see Vesuvius in near Naples, but also, of course, as you come down the Calabrian coast, you look out towards Stromboli and
Vulcano.
and Vulcano itself. Yeah,
There were 5.
Well, Etna, you'd see Etna as well. So that's
yes,
4.
but there was Vesuvius, Vulcano, Stromboli.
And there'll be another one, someone near Etna, which near Vesuvius, which I can't remember.
But anyway, yes, I couldn't remember it.
Yeah.
But anyway, I thought you might have it on the top of your tongue. But,
No,
but I mean, it was a fabulous train journey.
Yeah.
I mean, I could recommend it to anybody.
And also, can I also say, extremely cheap.
Yes.
It doesn't cost very much at all, and the trains are fantastic. So
Yeah,
a really worthwhile journey. Yeah.
And from Milan, it was overnight. I mean, it was the nighttime bit was, well, you didn't see Rome really because you were asleep.
No.
So you got on at 8 o'clock, but you got to Naples just before Naples at breakfast time.
Yeah.
I know it was it was a couchette. I expected to be in a dormitory or something, but I wasn't. I had a room to myself. It was amazing, absolutely amazing. Yeah.
Well, and you've actually prompted me, and it's one thing that we should all research a bit more is train travel in general.
Yeah.
So that's something to look out for.
The man in room 61, he's the one.
Yes.
Ah, right.
Man in seat 61.
Anyone else with another question, or otherwise we might convene there for supper. Well,
Can I just say,
Jenny, yes.
Yeah, that Lara, it hasn't come through on chat, that word. I've just checked.
Well, all right. Yeah.
Well,
Unless anybody else has got it. I haven't
Let me
got
see
it
if
on
I
my-
can type it here.
Thanks. Sorry to be a pain, but thank
can
you.
I just say tonight's talk was just absolutely fascinating. It was
Oh,
Yes,
thank you.
Lovely.
brilliant,
Absolutely brilliant.
brilliant tonight. Really,
Thank you so much.
No,
Really enjoyed it.
Ian, thanks,
Thank you.
Lara. Bye.
Thank you. Now, next
then.
week, we are on Thursday, not Tuesday, aren't we? Because
Yeah.
unfortunately,
Right.
next
I'll
Tuesday,
celebrate.
we have our ATO general meeting. So
Okay.
we're on Thursday next week, but I'll send out the emails to remind you about all of that.
And where are we going?
So we're going to Puglia next week. So join us.
Oh,
for-
don't go.
Yes.
I really want to go to Puglia.
Yeah.